In a quiet, sun-drenched village called Mugwato lived a woman named Nyarai, whose voice was unlike anything anyone had ever heard. When she sang, even the wind seemed to pause to listen. Her songs floated over the maize fields in the early morning, touching hearts, bringing comfort to widows, orphans, and anyone carrying pain. People said her voice could reach the ancestors, and some believed it healed more than medicine ever could. But the one person who should have cherished her gift the most, her husband Tafadzwa, saw it as a threat. While the village celebrated her, Tafadzwa grew cold and bitter. In his mind, a wife's voice belonged only inside the home, behind closed doors, not soaring through the village for all to hear. Every note Nyarai sang felt like an insult to his pride, and instead of love, he began to see her gift as an act of disobedience. The very voice that lifted others slowly became the target of his silent rage. Tafadzwa was not an ordinary man in Mugwato. He walked with a chest full of pride and a voice that others obeyed without question. He was a respected member of the cattlemen's circle, a powerful group of elders who believed that a man's authority should never be challenged, especially not by a woman. In their eyes, a woman was meant to cook, clean, bear children, and remain silent unless spoken to. Emotions were for the weak. And Tafadzwa, he was anything but weak. He ruled his home the same way he ruled the cattle field, with an iron hand and cold silence. But Nyarai, his wife, didn't fit into that mold. Her voice was too loud, too strong, too beautiful. The villagers loved her songs. They would stop their chores just to hear her sing. Women smiled when she sang of strength. Children laughed when she sang of joy. And even old men wiped tears when her melodies spoke of pain. At first, Tafadzwa tried to ignore it, but then the whispers started. Men from the village began saying, "Your wife's voice is louder than yours." Some laughed, some admired her, but Tafadzwa only heard disrespect. The members of the cattlemen's circle fed his bitterness like firewood. They said things like, "If you can't control her, you don't own her." One even joked, "Soon, she'll be singing orders over your cattle." Each word was a dagger to Tafadzwa's pride. Slowly, he started believing that Nyarai's voice wasn't just a voice. It was rebellion. It was shame. It was a threat to everything he believed a woman should be. Jealousy wrapped around him like a snake. He watched her from the shadows as she laughed with the villagers. He heard her sing to children and saw how others smiled at her, but all he could feel was rage. Why was her voice stronger than his silence? Why did people listen to her more than they feared him? That jealousy grew inside him, dark and ugly. He stopped seeing her as his wife and started seeing her as his enemy. He began punishing her with coldness. No words, no warmth, just long stares and sharp silence. At night, he would turn his back to her. In the morning, he'd leave without saying a word. Nyarai noticed the change, but she kept singing. Maybe she hoped her voice would bring him back. Maybe she believed her song still had the power to heal him. But Tafadzwa had already made up his mind. He believed Nyarai's voice was poison, and the only cure was silence. The man who once held her hand with love now clenched his fists in secret. And while the village praised her, Tafadzwa was planning something darker. The fire of jealousy inside him had turned into hatred, and all he wanted was to put an end to the voice that had made him feel small. Tafadzwa didn't just want her to stop singing, he wanted to erase her sound forever. And so, the seeds of something cruel and unforgivable began to grow in his heart. Even after Tafadzwa locked her inside the house, Nyarai didn't stop singing. Her voice, soft but strong, still slipped through the cracks of wooden windows and echoed into the village like a breeze that couldn't be caught. She sang when he left for the fields. She sang when he slammed the doors. She sang through her pain, through her fear, through the silence he tried to force on her. Her songs weren't just melodies anymore. They became messages, stories and prayers for the ones who had no voice, for every woman hiding bruises beneath her dress, for every widow who cried alone at night, for every child who had lost a mother too soon. Her voice became their hope. People still gathered near her home, even if they could only hear her from afar. They didn't need to see her to feel her spirit. Her words were carried by the wind and landed in the hearts of those who needed healing. Mothers would stop and place a hand on their chest when her songs floated by. Some would whisper, "She's still singing," with tears in their eyes. And in a way, that gave them courage too. Tafadzwa tried everything to stop it. He threatened her. He shouted. He removed the windows. He warned the villagers not to come near. But none of it worked, because Nyarai's voice was no longer just her own. It belonged to the people now. Her songs lived in their memories. Children hummed her tunes. Old women whispered her lyrics while they cooked. Her voice had escaped the walls he built, and it was growing louder with every soul it touched. Inside that house, Nyarai endured so much. Hunger, loneliness, even beatings. But she kept singing, because deep inside, she believed her voice had a purpose. She wasn't just singing to survive, she was singing to change something. And it worked. Slowly, the village began to shift. Women who once walked with their heads down began to lift their eyes. Men who used to laugh at emotions began to listen in silence. Even some of the cattlemen started questioning their ways. It was as if her voice was breaking a curse that had been there for generations. Nyarai never saw the change with her own eyes, locked away as she was. But the people outside were changing because of her. They began to speak up. They began to share their own stories. Her voice had become the beginning of something bigger, a quiet revolution that started with one woman's refusal to be silent. And Tafadzwa, he felt it too. He felt the shift, the way people looked at him now, not with fear, but with disappointment, with questions, with anger. The more Nyarai sang, the more control he lost. His shadow, once long and feared, was now shrinking under the light of her voice. But he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. That's when he knew. If her voice wouldn't die on its own, he would have to kill it himself. The morning felt different. The sky was still dark, and the air carried a strange stillness. Tafadzwa was already awake, long before the village began to stir. While the roosters crowed and the goats yawned, he moved silently, like a hunter. But he wasn't hunting animals. He was planning to break something sacred. He lit the fire outside with shaking hands. Though not from fear, the flames danced beneath a large black pot. He filled it with water and watched as it slowly began to bubble. This wasn't water for porridge. It wasn't for tea. It was for silence, for control, for punishment. Inside the house, Nyarai, unaware of what was coming, moved softly across the floor, her scars still fresh from past abuse, yet her spirit unbroken. She began her usual morning routine. She warmed the cups, prepared the herbs, and hummed a gentle melody, a song of peace, maybe hope. Even after all he'd done, her voice still found a way to survive. That alone made Tafadzwa's anger burn hotter than the flames outside. He watched her through the doorway like a shadow, breathing heavy, as if her song was the last straw pressing on his pride. As she turned to pour the tea, Tafadzwa stormed in, boiling pot in hand. No words, no warning, just steam, rage, and silence. And then he did it. He lifted the pot and poured the scalding water directly onto her back. The sound was sickening. Her skin hissed, her body twisted, and then came the scream. But her scream wasn't like the others in Mugwato. It wasn't just pain. It was deep, raw, and filled with something ancient, like a soul being torn from the sky. It was the kind of sound that made birds flee from trees and left silence in its place. That scream was the last note of a song, too powerful to be broken, even by boiling water. It echoed through the village, bouncing off clay walls and waking everyone. People froze. Mothers clutched their children. Elders whispered prayers. Something terrible had just happened, something they would never forget. Tafadzwa didn't run. He stood there, watching her fall to the floor, watching the skin on her back blister and burn, watching the woman who once brought joy to an entire village collapse in agony. For a moment, he thought he had won. He thought the voice was gone, silenced at last. But outside, people were already gathering. They had heard the scream, and they knew whose voice it was. Nyarai's pain was not hers alone. It belonged to the village now. It belonged to every woman who had suffered in silence. And even as she lay broken, even as her body burned, there was something Tafadzwa didn't realize. He may have hurt her body, but her voice, her spirit, that was far from gone. Because what he didn't know was this: some voices don't die, they rise. And this was only the beginning, was only the sun had barely risen when the news spread through Mugwato like wildfire. People rushed toward Tafadzwa's house with heavy hearts and trembling hands. They had heard the scream, but no one imagined the horror they were about to see. Nyarai, the voice of the village, was lying on the cold floor, her skin blistered and raw from boiling water. Her once bright eyes were now dimmed by pain, her lips trembling but silent. The doctors came quickly from Mashikiri, a nearby town known for its healers. They wrapped her wounds, whispered prayers, and gave her medicine, but even they could not undo the damage Tafadzwa had caused. The elders of the village stood in stunned silence, some weeping openly. These were men and women who had seen war, famine, and heartbreak, but nothing had struck them like the sight of Nyarai, wounded and voiceless. The same woman who had comforted them in their darkest days now lay still, her songs replaced by the sound of her struggling breath. But even in her silence, something about her spirit remained. Her eyes, though heavy with pain, still carried strength. They spoke without words. They said, "This is not the end." While the men argued in hushed tones about justice and shame, it was the women of Mugwato who truly moved. They didn't need a meeting or a speech. They had seen enough. They gathered in secret at the home of a young midwife named Amari, a bold soul with fire in her heart. She had grown up listening to Nyarai's songs, and now, seeing her broken body, something inside Amari snapped. "If her voice is gone," she whispered to the circle of women, "then we will be her voice. We will carry her songs. We will not let her be forgotten." That night, something powerful began to rise in Mugwato. The women lit candles. They sang in soft voices, repeating Nyarai's words, her melodies, her messages. Some couldn't sing well, but that didn't matter. It wasn't about the sound. It was about the promise. A promise that what Tafadzwa tried to silence would now grow even louder. They called themselves the Sisterhood of Fire, not because they sought revenge through violence, but because they burned with truth, with courage, and with unity. And together, they vowed to protect every woman, every child, and every voice that had once been forced into silence. Every evening they gathered, outside Nyarai's window, in the fields, by the riverside. They sang her songs and created new ones. Songs about pain, songs about rising, songs about women who would no longer be afraid. Even men began to listen. The village started changing. Slowly but surely, people began to question the silence that had lived in their homes for years. They started to see Nyarai not just as a victim, but as a symbol of strength. Tafadzwa, hiding in shame, began to feel the weight of what he had done. His power was slipping. The respect he once held was replaced with disgust. The louder the women sang, the smaller he became. And though Nyarai still could not speak, the whole village now heard her louder than ever. Because a voice like hers, even when broken, doesn't disappear. It spreads, it transforms, and it lives on through those brave enough to carry it forward. When the village elder, Gogo Mutale, finally stood before the people and called for judgment, the air in Mugwato was thick with tension. The entire village had gathered under the large baobab tree, where justice was always served, not by law books, but by truth and spirit. Gogo Mutale, with her wrinkled face and sharp eyes, spoke in a voice that echoed with history. She had watched over Mugwato for more than 80 years, and her words carried the weight of ancestors. "This house has been silenced by fire," she said, "and the fire must now face the spirits." But Tafadzwa only laughed. He stood in the center of the crowd, with arms crossed, and a smirk stretched across his face. "This is a man's world," he said loudly, his voice dripping with pride. "No spirit can judge me. No woman can break me." His words rolled through the village like poison, but no one cheered. The people stayed quiet. They had heard enough from him. Now, they wanted to hear what the spirits had to say. That night, everything began to change. It started with his cows. Healthy and strong during the day, they were found dead by sunrise. No wounds, no sickness, just gone. One by one, they fell, and by the third day, the fields were silent. Next, the roof of his house caved in during a clear night. No rain, no wind. Tafadzwa had just stepped outside when it happened. He stood in the yard, barefoot, staring at the ruins above his bed. He told himself it was bad luck, nothing more. But then the whispers started. Children in the village refused to walk past his house. One boy screamed when Tafadzwa walked by, saying he saw black smoke behind him. Another claimed he heard crying from beneath Tafadzwa's floor. Even the dogs stopped barking at strangers, but howled every time Tafadzwa came near. People said they saw shadows moving in his home at night, even when no fire burned. He tried to sleep, but dreams would not let him. Every night he saw Nyarai standing in the field, her body glowing, her mouth open, but not screaming, singing. The same songs he once hated now haunted him. Her eyes stared into his soul, full of light and sorrow. He would wake up sweating, heart racing, and yet the melody would still ring in his ears. The village began to believe what they always knew deep down. The ancestors had taken Nyarai's side. They were angry, not just for her, but for every woman who had been beaten into silence. Gogo Mutale called it the trial of the ancestors, and in that trial, no man could lie, no pride could protect, no bribe could buy forgiveness. Tafadzwa tried to speak, to explain, but his voice cracked. Words slipped away like water through fingers. For the first time, he felt powerless, and as the people watched him with cold eyes, he finally understood. This wasn't just about what he did to Nyarai. This was about all the pain he thought he could bury. The ancestors had risen, and their judgment had already begun. Nyarai stepped into the village square during the harvest fire. Her body was still healing, her steps slow, but her presence was powerful. She held a drum in her hands. Without saying a word, she beat it once, then again. The sound cut through the air and silenced the crowd. Everyone turned to her. Her scars were visible, glowing in the firelight, but she didn't hide. She looked straight ahead, unshaken. The people stared, waiting. Then Amari, the midwife, began to sing. It was one of Nyarai's old songs, one the village hadn't heard from her own lips in months. Another woman joined, then another. One by one, voices filled the square. They sang Nyarai's songs, every word, every note, like they'd lived inside them all along. Women moved closer, forming a circle around Nyarai. Their voices grew louder, stronger. Even those who had once stayed silent sang now. The song was no longer just hers. It belonged to all of them. Tafadzwa was there, standing in the crowd. At first he didn't move, but as the women sang louder, something changed in his face. He watched them reclaim the voice he tried to destroy. His confidence cracked. He backed away, step by step, looking around like he had nowhere to hide. Then he turned and ran. No one followed. They didn't need to, because in that moment, Nyarai had already won. Her voice, once nearly silenced, had returned through the people she had inspired. She didn't need revenge. She had something stronger, her truth, her strength, and a village that finally stood with her. Tafadzwa disappeared from the village after the harvest fire. No one stopped him. No one asked where he was going. He walked into the forest alone, carrying nothing but shame and fear. People whispered that he had gone mad, talking to himself one day and silent the next. Days turned into weeks. Then word came back. He had lost his voice. He could no longer speak. He couldn't shout, couldn't curse, couldn't even whisper his own name. The man who once demanded silence from his wife now lived in it himself. Some said it was justice. Others called it a curse. But everyone agreed. It wasn't just sickness. It was something deeper, something spiritual. The villagers said Nyarai's spirit had taken back what he tried to steal. Others believed that ancestors had used his own weapon, silence, against him. He had turned her songs into pain. Now, he lived in a world without sound. Tafadzwa tried to return to the village once. He stood at the edge, thin, dirty and trembling. His lips moved, but nothing came out, not even a breath. Children ran away from him, calling him a ghost. Women looked through him like he wasn't there. Even the animals didn't seem to notice him. He had become invisible. Gogo Mutale, the village elder, said softly, "The mouth that silences truth will one day beg to be heard." No one argued. Tafadzwa had become a walking warning, not just for men like him, but for anyone who thought power came from fear. In the forest, he lived alone. He built a small hut from sticks and mud, but it fell apart during the first rain. Still, he didn't leave. Some hunters said they saw him sitting by the river, staring at his reflection for hours. Sometimes they heard him try to sing, but no sound came. His voice was gone, but the regret stayed. His hands shook when he remembered the boiling water. His eyes filled with tears when he heard the distant songs of the village women. Nyarai never spoke of him again. She didn't need to. Her life had moved forward, her strength growing every day. The Sisterhood of Fire spread her story across other villages. More women found the courage to speak, to sing, to rise. And Tafadzwa became nothing more than a fading memory. He wasn't dead, But he wasn't really alive either. He was a shadow of the man he used to be, a ghost trapped in a forest, surrounded by the silence he once demanded. And that silence was louder than any scream. Some say he still tries to speak, that every night he mouths words into the wind, begging for forgiveness. But no one hears him, and maybe that's the real curse. Not the loss of his voice, but the truth that no one is listening anymore. Because in the end, Tafadzwa didn't just lose his voice, he lost his place in the story. Years passed, but Nyarai's fire never faded. Her body had healed, her voice had returned in new ways, stronger, deeper, shared. With support from the women of Mugwato and help from nearby villages, she built something the land had never seen before. It was called the House of Echoes. Not a hospital, not a shelter. It was a sanctuary, a place where silence was broken, where pain was not hidden, and where stories could live without fear. The house stood at the edge of Mugwato, simple but full of life. Painted in bright colors, covered in symbols of healing and hope, it welcomed anyone who had been hurt or forgotten. Women came with burns, bruises, and broken hearts. Children arrived quiet, unsure, eyes wide with fear. But inside, they found peace. Nyarai did not ask them to speak. She asked them to sing. Every morning began with music, not forced, not polished, just voices, raw and real. Women sang as they cooked. Children sang while planting in the garden. The sound of healing became a rhythm that echoed beyond the walls. It became the soul of the house. Nyarai never called herself a leader. She said she was just a drum for others to beat on. But her presence changed everything. She taught them the same songs that once brought her comfort. She shared her story, not with bitterness, but with strength. She showed her scars without shame. And by doing that, she gave others the courage to face their own. The House of Echoes grew. Women from other villages came. Some stayed. Some returned home stronger. Some started their own houses. Soon, Nyarai's voice was not just heard in Mugwato. It was heard across rivers, borders, and lands far beyond. People began to speak of the woman whose voice could not be silenced, the woman whose pain became power. The villagers watched with pride. Even the elders who once stayed quiet during her suffering now sat on the front steps, listening to her songs. Children pointed to her and said, "She is the one who turned pain into music." Nyarai never forgot where she came from. She planted maize around the house, just like her mother had. She wore her grandmother's beads. She lit candles for the women who didn't survive. Every name was remembered, every story honored. And inside the House of Echoes, laughter returned. Not the kind that hides sadness, but the real kind. The deep belly laughter of people who survived the storm and found the sun again. They danced together, they healed together, and they made sure the world never forgot that once a woman in Mugwato was burned for singing, and then used her voice to build a sanctuary. Her legend grew. She became known not for the pain she suffered, but for the joy she spread. A scar that sings, a fire that warmed, not burned. And in every note, her spirit lived on, stronger, louder, unbreakable. Nyarai's story did not fade with time. It grew louder, stronger, and brighter. People from distant places heard it, not just as a story of one woman, but as a message that touched every heart that had ever known pain and risen again. Her voice had become more than a memory. It was a prophecy, a rhythm passed down from one generation to the next, like an old drumbeat that never stopped. In schools, children were taught about Nyarai, not as a victim, but as a symbol. They learned her songs before they learned to write. They danced to the same melodies that once echoed through Mugwato's fields. Women stitched her story into cloth, bright kente patterns of gold, red, and blue, each line in the fabric telling a piece of her life. Every fold of that cloth was a reminder that strength wears scars, and courage has a voice. No one told Tafadzwa's story. No one sang his name. He became a warning whispered in silence. Mothers told their sons, "Do not become like him." His legacy was nothing but a shadow behind Nyarai's light, because in the end, it wasn't his violence that defined the future. It was her resistance. Elders now say that karma wears kente, that when you harm the voice of truth, it returns dressed in colors too bold to ignore, that when you try to bury a song, it rises louder, stronger, with an army behind it. Nyarai didn't fight with fists or revenge. She fought by staying alive, by refusing to disappear, by building a life out of the ashes meant to destroy her. Her name became a chant in protests, a lullaby in nurseries, a hymn in ceremonies. Women wore kente not just for fashion, but as armor. They sang in markets, in fields, in churches. They sang even when they were afraid, because Nirai had shown them, your voice is your power, and no one has the right to take it away. Even the land seemed to remember her. Birds sang her tunes. Rain fell softly over the house of echoes, and every girl who stepped through those doors knew she was walking in the footsteps of someone unbreakable. Nirai never claimed to be a hero. She simply chose not to vanish. That choice changed everything. And so, her story lives on, not because of what Tafadzwa did to her, but because she lived, because she healed, because she dared to sing when silence was safer. Her voice became a seed that bloomed across the continent. And that is why today, when a woman lifts her voice against injustice, when a child sings through pain, or when someone wraps themselves in kente and walks proud, they are not alone. They carry Nyarai with them, because karma listens, and sometimes it sings back.